18. Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative Findings and Conclusions. The Assistant Secretary's findings of the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative, which remain under investigation based on examination of records under its control, include the following. 1. The Federal Indian Boarding School system was expansive, consisting of 408 federal Indian boarding schools, comprised of 431 specific sites across 37 states or then territories, including 21 schools in Alaska and 7 schools in Hawaii. 2. Multiple generations of American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian children were induced or compelled by the federal government to experience the federal Indian boarding school system given their political and legal status as Indians and Native Hawaiians. 3. The twin federal policy of Indian territorial dispossession and Indian assimilation through Indian education extended beyond the federal Indian boarding school system, including an identified 1,000+ other federal and non-federal institutions, including Indian day schools, sanitariums, asylums, orphanages, and standalone dormitories that involved education of Indian people, mainly Indian children. 4. Funding for the federal Indian boarding school system included both federal funds through congressional appropriations and funds obtained from tribal trust accounts for the benefit of Indians and maintained by the United States. 5. The federal Indian boarding school system deployed militarized and identity alteration methodologies to assimilate American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian people, primarily children, through education. 6. The federal Indian boarding school system predominantly utilized manual labor of American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian children to compensate for the poor conditions of school facilities and lack of financial support from the federal government. 7. The federal Indian boarding school system discouraged or prevented the use of American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian languages or cultural or religious practices through punishment, including corporal punishment. 8. Tribal preferences for the possible disinterment or repatriation of remains of children discovered in marked or unmarked burial sites across the federal Indian boarding school system vary widely. Depending on the religious and cultural practices of the Indian tribe, Alaska Native village, or the Native Hawaiian community, it may prefer to disinter or repatriate any remains of a child discovered across the federal Indian boarding school system for return to the child's home or territory, or to leave the child's remains undisturbed in its current burial site. Moreover, some burial sites contain human remains or parts of remains of multiple individuals, or human remains that were relocated from other burial sites, thereby preventing tribal and individual identification. 9. The federal government has not provided a forum or opportunity for survivors or descendants of survivors of federal Indian boarding schools or their families to voluntarily detail their experiences in the federal Indian boarding school system. Based on the initial findings of the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative, which remain under investigation, and despite factors outside the department's control, including the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and funding issues, the Assistant Secretary concludes that 1. The United States creation of the Federal Indian Boarding School System was part of a broader policy aimed at acquiring collective territories from Indian tribes, Alaska Natives, and the Native Hawaiian community, and lands from individuals therein. From the earliest days of the Republic, the United States' official objective, based on federal and other records, was to sever the cultural and economic connection between Indian tribes, Alaska Native villages, and Native Hawaiian community and their territories. The assimilation of Indian children through the federal Indian boarding school system was intentional and part of that broader goal of Indian territorial dispossession for the expansion of the United States. 2. Assimilation of American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian people eventually became an objective of federal policy in and of itself. The federal Indian boarding school policies targeted Indian children as one method to accomplish this objective. 3. The intentional targeting and removal of American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian children to achieve the goal of forced assimilation of Indian people was both traumatic and violent. Based on initial research, the department finds that hundreds of Indian children died throughout the federal Indian boarding school system. The department expects that continued investigation will reveal the approximate number of Indian children who died at federal Indian boarding schools to be in the thousands or tens of thousands. Many of those children were buried in unmarked or poorly maintained burial sites far from their Indian tribes, Alaska Native villages, the Native Hawaiian community, and families, often hundreds or even thousands of miles away. The department's research revealed at least 53 different burial sites across the federal Indian boarding school system and leads to an expectation that there are many more burial sites that will be identified with further research. The deaths of Indian children while under the care of the federal government or federally supported institutions led to the breakup of Indian families and the erosion of Indian tribes, Alaska Native villages, and the Native Hawaiian community. 4. Many more Indian children who survived the federal Indian boarding school system live with their experiences from the schools. Moreover, several generations of Indian children experienced the federal Indian boarding school system. The federal Indian boarding school system directly disrupted Indian families, Indian tribes, Alaska Native villages, and the Native Hawaiian community for nearly 2 centuries. 5. Further review is required to determine the reach and impact of the violence and trauma inflicted on Indian children through the federal Indian boarding school system. The department has recognized that targeting Indian children for the federal policy of Indian assimilation contributed to the loss of the following: 1. Life. 2. Physical and mental health. 3. Territories and wealth. 4. Tribal and family relations. And 5. Use of tribal languages. This policy also caused the erosion of tribal religious and cultural practices for Indian tribes, Alaska Native villages, and the Native Hawaiian community, and over many generations.